morning. Good to be with you. Hope everybody's glad to be here. Should be one of the highlights every week, right? If not the highlight, really, if you will. We've been studying Wednesday evening on, personal evangelism. And recently we've been talking about, turning people off. Now, if we're not prepared, that we will do more harm than good. Will actually shun people away from God. And so that got me to thinking, are there other ways that we can turn, we talked about those, some ways in the way we facilitate our teaching. We're not going to cover those in this lesson, but we're definitely going to look at some other ways that we might find ourselves turning off others to the kingdom of God. And for the most part, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 23, and our proof text this morning comes from verse 13, verse chapter 23. And we see, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in the people's faces, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in." So we see the scribes and the Pharisees back in Jesus' day were guilty of turning off people to the kingdom of God. So I think we could do from here, especially looking at the scribes and the Pharisees, and of course they're going to be our case study here this morning. But with some friends, especially like those of the Pharisees and the scribes, God needs no enemies, does he not? Pharisees profess great devotion to God. A few, like Saul, shared or were sincere in their efforts. However, most were hypocrites. And even Saul, in his sincerity, did so in error. They sat in Moses' seat, but many walked in Satan's shoes. They looked for the Messiah and his kingdom. We can see that over in Luke chapter 17, verse 20. So they professed to be looking for the Messiah, but when he came, they wanted nothing to do with it. With the kingdom at hand, now refused to enter and they purposely hindered others from entering in as well. Even as citizens of the kingdom ourselves in our present age, we will turn people off if they see us walking in the steps of the Pharisees. And that's what we're going to look at here this morning. The one way that I would say that we would turn off individuals to God is by giving lip service to God's law. We see that, again, Matthew chapter 23 we're going to be looking at it constantly. But we see there in the first three verses, it says, "Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to the disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say, and do not do." So the Pharisees gave lip service to God's law. Consider Matthew chapter 15, verse 8. It says, "These people draw near to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their hearts is far from me." So they gave, the Pharisees gave a lot of lip service about how great, they would stand, they would go out, be like, going out there on where 209 meets Wheeling Avenue. And standing, they'd be praying and saying, "Oh, look at me, look how great and holy I am. You want to be like me?" And a lot of people go, yeah, I want to be like him. And it wasn't it. That's what they wanted. They wanted to be seen by men. They would mitigate God's law. They would say, do as I say, not as I do. So by giving lip service, the Pharisees talked a good game. We see that in verses 29 through 31, where it says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Because that's what they were going to do to Christ. Here was the greatest prophet there ever had been. He worked many miracles they could not refute. As a matter of fact, many of them said they must, he's from some spiritual power because these things can't, but no, he can't be from God. He must be from Beelzebub, right? So just like here, they would sit there and tout and if we lived back in the day that they killed Jeremiah and all the other prophets, we would we wouldn't be partakers in that. We'd be wiser than that. They were also called the blind leading the blind too, weren't they? And their actions often were louder than their words. Consider James chapter 2 and verse 14 through 18. It says, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute in daily food, and one of you say to them, depart in peace, be warm and be filled, but you do not give them the things which they need for the body, what does it profit? What good is it? What is it good to say, oh, bless you, my son. Oh, I hope you find a coat. I hope you find some food. What good does that do? What good does it do to bless somebody? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. In other words, we got to put our money where our mouth is. If we are going to profess to be Christians, we got to live like Christians. We got to manifest that we are Christians. We cannot on Sunday come to church and try to be all holy, and then Friday night come and we're at the local sports bar getting drunk with all the other people watching the big game. What good does that do? That's being a hypocrite. You go around, condemning those who are homosexual, or those who practice illicit sexual stuff, but then you turn around and commit adultery on your wife. What's people going to say? Oh, there goes Jim the hypocrite. He goes to that hypocrite church. They must all be hypocrites. They let him join. That was the problem with the Pharisees. Look, I'm holier than thou, but then they turn around and, in private, they would sin with the best of them. 1 Peter 3:1 says, wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husband, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word might have won by the conduct of their wives. In other words, why, what, we're not going to pick on wives, but what he's saying is, if you would have behaved the way the Bible says that you ought to behave, you might have won over your mates, and they might have became Christians. But instead, you said you came to this church saying that you were a devout Christian, but when you got home, you was anything but. And why would a spouse want to go to a place where the hypocrites gather? Next, we see that the Pharisees, were guilty of turning off others by using a double standard. We find this in verse 4 of Matthew 23. It says, "For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves do not move them with one of their fingers." In other words, they would say, in order to be holy, you got to do all these things. But then they would turn around, they wouldn't levy those same things upon themselves. Whoops. Baby trap. It was a double standard. I was watching a video talking about the fall of the mega church. 15 since like 2000, 15 of the biggest mega churches are now almost complete. Most are completely gone, and the others are on their way out. Why? Double standards and hypocrisies. Over and over, they're either spending the money illicitly, or they're being caught in affairs and doing things that they on Sunday morning tell their people that they ought not to do. And that's why their empires are crumbling. People are saying, "Well, why am I going to this church?" Yeah, they got an auditorium that will hold 16,000 people, and it's mammoth and it's impressive, but double standards. Wait a minute. Joel Osteen, they collect $100 billion a year in donations. $100 billion a year. But yet, when it came to the flood that happened in Houston, Texas, did they open up their church, their $16 million church, to let in? No. Ain't got time. Oh, we're caught up in red tape. The county hasn't certified it. It was just one excuse. In other words, they didn't want people coming in and getting their place dirty. They didn't want squatters coming in. I gotta have that for, I gotta be generating my billions. And people saw right through it. What kind of hypocrisy is this? We're in need. I mean, that's what the Bible's all about. That's what Joel Osteen preaches about all the time, right? We need your money. We need to be spread. We need to be helping these people out. But then when he has the opportunity to help people out, couldn't be found. What happened? Now he wonders why, he can't get about a couple thousand people in there into his $16,000 16,000 person auditorium. Double standards. So, in what one expects and demands of others, needs to do that of himself as well. And what we teach others, thou shalt not, thou shalt live like this. This is the fruit of the Spirit, blah, blah, blah. These are not the fruits of the Spirit. We need to be doing those ourselves. We don't need to be giving lip service. Romans chapter 2, verse 21 says, "You therefore who teach others, do not teach yourself. You who preach that a man should not steal, you do not steal." Pretty simple, is it not? But that's why those mega churches are crumbling, is because they were stealing. They were getting caught up. One of them was $40,000 on a church retreat that church members couldn't go to, only executive council. $40,000 for a vacation, really? And what he criticizes or judges others, he does himself. A hypocrite, right? That's why Christ said over and over, you hypocrites. The old double standard. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 says, judge not that you be not judged. For what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back onto you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye and do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or can you not say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. That's where many, well, I don't know so much here, but in other places that I've visited and attended, there was a lot of planksters. A lot of people grumbling about, do you see what so-and-so was doing? Did you see, oh, did you hear about so-and-so? Always tearing down somebody. And then they themselves, the biggest gossiper and hypocrite that you ever saw. Complaining about how somebody's children was acting, and then theirs is running around like demons. Oh well, little Susie, she got some issues, so we're trying to mitigate those. But look over there. People see through that stuff. We always think we're real. I'm smart, We got to be careful with double standards. Whatever we levy, whatever we teach, whatever we preach, we got to live it. We got to do it, because people will be turned off by God or about God if we do not. The other thing that they were doing that was turning off people to God was by practicing religion for show. We kind of spoke of this already. Whoops. I'm sorry. But this is in verses 5 through 12 of Matthew 23. But all their words they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garment. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, readings in the marketplace, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you do not be called Rabbi, for the one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do you not call anyone on earth your father? For one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Really, verse 12 is really, talking about what the essence of being a Christian is. It's not about me. It's not about perpetuating. It's not how great I am. It's about humbling ourselves and just doing the best that we can do. But not for the Pharisees. No, not for the Pharisees. They wanted to be seen by everybody. They had these great big robes. Whoever had the biggest robe was the most holy man. It's not wrong to be seen or heard doing any religious act. That's not what we're saying. We don't preach in private. We offer public prayer, but we don't do it to be boasting. We don't do it to be, hey, look at me. I say, consider Paul and Silas in jail. They were singing. They were in jail and they were singing, were they not? They were worshiping. It is if it is done to be seen by men or to impress them with our devotion. Oh, there goes Brother Jim. Oh, I better act like holy, Oh, look at me. I'm the most holy man. Oh, look how holy. That type of thing. Christ said that, your prayers aren't going to be answered by God because they've already been answered for the reason why you were given them. You wanted to hear accolades from your fellow man. You got you received your reward. And that turns people off. People start to see, oh, wait a minute, he puts on a good show, but again, he doesn't do exactly what he says he's going to do. And then we, as well as they, can turn off others by inventing loopholes. Inventing loopholes to sidestep God's law. We see this in verses 16 through 22 there in chapter 23. It says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold of the temple that sanctifies the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obligated to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it." So, in other words, they were selective in administering these oaths, if you will. Oh, well, if you made if you just uttered that, to some Joe Schmo or to God or to the altar or to the temple, well, it's not a big deal. But then as soon as there was something to be gained, like the gold or nice hefty chunk of meat to be put on the altar, that like a heave offering, where I'm going to get like a nice thigh for supper. Oh yeah, you got to follow through with that now. The Pharisee loopholes. We see that in Matthew chapter 15 verse 5, but he says, whoever to his father or mother, what profit you might have received from me, it is a gift to God. See, that's how remember that they invented that loophole. All these young people are starting to make their fortune, and granted, their parents had helped them, and of course, there was no Social Security back then. There was no means of support. But a lot of these youngsters, if you will, once they started to make it, and their mothers and fathers were starting to get older, and what? Well, we don't feel like cooking tonight. Can we come over to eat? And they'd be like, oh, your God says you're supposed to take care of us. Oh well, and then they go to the fair. Hey, got to help me out here. Well, why don't you just swear that we'll say you swore a portion to the temple or to God, and we'll just say that alleviates. So they were just completely nullifying God's law. Gee, Mom, I gave your portion to the church. I ain't got nothing for you. I met my obligation. And what good does that do? I mean, the Pharisees were becoming fat cats. I mean, it was good for them. Well, we'll only take 15%. You can keep the other 85. It was lucrative business. That's why they were doing it. People see through that. Kind of just like the denominational loopholes that we see, right? Mark 16:16 says, "He who believes and is baptized will be saved." It doesn't say, "He who that is not baptized." That's what they want to try to, oh, it's a loophole. We say we read it for what it is. It says, "He who believes and is baptized shall be saved," and we say, "He who does not believe shall be lost." Oh, well, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say he who does not believe and is not baptized will be lost, or it doesn't say he who believes and is not baptized. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say they will be lost. So everything, legalistic, if you will. That's what I would argue, but they say we're the legalists. And then Acts chapter 20 verse 7. It doesn't say every first day of the week. I mean, it doesn't say every first day of the month or every first day of the year. It's implied. What's the implications by what's being said there? It's just like, well, it says we need to observe the Lord's Supper. We don't have to do it every first day of the week. What? Well, but then they'll cite First Corinthians chapter 16, where we're to lay by a store upon the first day of the week. Oh, it's every first day of the week there, and Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Every day of the week we can lay by a store. We invent loopholes to get out of it. And we invent our own. Don't get me wrong, Church of Christ ain't. We got our own, misuse of relative terms. How many brethren parse over the word children and the qualifications of an elder? It means two or more. No, it means one. And a lot of times that's I think, to disqualify somebody. Or, modest ends up being whoever's in the pulpit, their interpretation of what modest is. And et cetera, et cetera. Or we demand specific condemnation and ignore general purposes. Where does it say you can't gamble? It doesn't say anywhere about gambling in the Bible. Well, what about the principles that it violates? It doesn't say anything about that I can't go to Jim's Bar and Grill. What about violating the principles about, abstain from all forms of evil, that type of thing? And then we turn people off by practicing selective obedience, just like inventing loopholes. Here we don't invent loopholes, but we use selective obedience. The problem was not I should say, this is in verse 23 for the Pharisees. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay a tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone." When it comes to obeying God's law, how much of it do you have to obey? All of it, right? We can't be selective in our obedience. Now, I'm not saying that grace and mercy isn't going to apply to things that we have unknowingly violated, or that we innocently made mistakes. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a big difference between a sin of ignorance and a sin of purpose. I don't think God is going to be too kind on those who purposely sin or knowingly try to gain God, right? So the problem is not in insisting on obeying in the smallest of details. That's not what that's not the issue. Actually, we should be worried. God is as great and as mighty as we say he is. We ought to be worried about the smallest of details, right? Have you ever met the guy? Do you I know accounts in the Bible of a guy who innocently put his hand up to stabilize the cart who was smitten dead. Now we would say, well, what was wrong with that? He just was trying to keep the ark from falling over. I mean, that was a good thing to do, was it not? Yeah, but God said, don't touch. He probably thought it was a small thing. Probably thought it was, well, he means don't touch it and tarnish it or get a fingerprint on it. That's what it means, No, man, don't touch. However, the problem is when not insisting on obeying in every detail. That's the problem. So it isn't about, but there's nothing wrong being a legalist and saying that we need to do these things. That's what God said we need to do those things. We're just repeating what God said. The problem is turning a blind eye to certain things that we may not like. Just like we've been studying about the old law. If we were guilty of one part, we were guilty of all of it. And now, has that principle gone away? I don't think so. And obeying religious acts, but neglect inward purity. Now, again, kind of that do as I say, not as I do. Acting holier than thou. In other words, Lord, you stand on the day of judgment. Well, Lord, I attended church twice on Sunday, and even on Wednesday night I went. I was one of the most faithful attenders of services at the East Cambridge Church of Christ. Yeah, but your heart was rotten. It wasn't about attending church. It was about having your heart right with God. Because if your heart was right with God, you would have been at church. And I think this is the last one. The Pharisees would turn people off, and we too, by religion-coded ungodliness. In other words, cloaking sins in acts of righteousness. In verses 25 and 28, we see how the Pharisees were doing this. It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first see the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appears beautiful outwardly, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanliness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." It's like, when we do this, it's like sugar-coated pills. The nasty. It still tastes nasty on the inside, right? It's still rotten on the inside. Or chocolate-covered worms. Just because it has, don't bite into it, or you'll be surprised, right? In other words, it looks good and it even tastes good on the outside. Or the old, used car salesman, yep, bought it from grandma. Never drove it over 5 miles an hour for all 197 miles that's on it, you know. And you drive it for a week and it explodes. In other words, we get wrapped up in the text where it says extortion, self-indulgence, hypocrisy, lawlessness, murder. We would never commit those things. Never, never. However, when it comes to hatred of our fellow brethren, malice towards our neighbors, gossiping with our fellow brethren, meddling in the affairs of others, or vengeance, I gotta get mine back. Oh, I was so offended. We're justified in those. Oh, I'm not gossiping. I'm concerned about my brother's well-being. I'm just trying to find out what's going on with him so that I can pray for him. I just need to know all the details. No, you don't. You just need to know to pray for the person. You don't need to know the details. Oh, did you hear about so and so? Well, I'm not meddling in my kids' affairs. Yeah, they're a separate. Well, but I just want to make sure they're doing things right. We can always try to justify what we want, and that's what we end up doing. We end up cloaking these sins and righteous behavior, if you will. And don't forget about laziness and snobbery, or covetousness. And when was the last time you heard a good lesson on covetousness? Not too many people preach those, do they? Or you ever, take that back. It is preached about. But when was the last time you heard of somebody being held accountable to covetousness? Oh, never. The world sees it. Just as Christ saw it in his day. We're turning people off to religion because of the way that we're practicing religion. So as we conclude, as we wrap up, we need to remember, don't allow yourself to be turned off to the acceptance of the kingdom of God. Disregard how other people's act and behave. We can't control what others do. And we should not use others either as a predicate for circumventing the things that God would have us to do. In other words, don't use the way somebody behaves in the church to say, I never become a Christian because of that person. That's faulty logic. Don't allow yourself to be turned off to the responsibilities of the kingdom. Well, I'm not going to do that because brother so-and-so is not doing it. And if brother, so if it's good for him, it's good for me. No, don't be worried about what brother so-and-so is doing. Matter of fact, why don't you rebuke him and get yourself right? And we don't allow ourselves to be turned off to the blessings of the kingdom. When we create these loopholes, or we use these double standards, or we try to elevate ourselves to be holier than thou, we're just starting to block the blessings of the kingdom. We're living unrighteously. We are being pharisaical. We don't want to do that. And we don't want to allow ourselves to be turned off to the hope of the kingdom. And that's what the invitation is all about. I think everybody here this morning has been baptized. So we won't talk about those who need to be baptized. But for those who are in Christ, who have erred, maybe you've been guilty of turning some people off. Maybe you have been guilty of some of these things we talked about. No better time now to come forward than to ask for the prayers and to begin living life the way that God would have you to do. So if that's the case, why don't you raise your hand or come forward, whatever that case may be. If you're subject to the gospel call in any shape, form, or manner, let it be known as we stand and sing that song has been chosen. Hear the sweet voice.